Equity Week is a national week of reflection on issues of equity in resource distribution in Kenya, and in 2017 it took place from November the 13th to the 17th. Several events were held in various venues in Nairobi and Elgeyo Marakwet County and brought together individuals from academia, the civil society, government, the arts community, development organizations, and citizens for a conversation about the promise of a more equitable development enshrined in Kenya's 2010 Constitution. During this year's Equity Week, while participants and presenters alike sought to find solutions to the unequitable share of resources, it was prudent to first understand the very concept of equity to enable conversation from a more informed position. Debating the meaning of equity meant that participants had to understand the history of inequality in Kenya before they could resolve on measures for the future.
This week just helped those who were taking part to just learn more about equity, to appreciate what equity is all about.
So equity, I would define it as providing to everyone according to their need. So simply means that if a certain area people need agriculture services, we provide them with agriculture services. If in another area people are more needy in terms of health services, we provide health services. But at the end goal of equity is making sure that everybody enjoys the same level of livelihood that everybody else enjoys. That's the essence of equity.
To start with history of a long time ago, anthropologists tell us that at least in the indigenous communities in what is now Kenya, we didn't have much distinction between people. They were all treated equally. There was no hierarchy. There were no chiefs. So that most communities, which now make up the Republic of Kenya, lived in very egalitarian societies until the British colonial powers came. So colonialism brought immediately distinctions, differences between different people, different groups. And then we had independence, and we thought perhaps now we will really have equality, everybody will be treated. The concept of citizenship then began to take root, but that didn't happen, as we know. And this time it didn't happen because some African leaders, including the distinguished Jomo Kenyatta, had their own ideas. And it was an idea of tribalism, which had not been a major issue until really independence, in a manner of speaking. And so we had new kind of classifications, hierarchies, and that created distinction between not only Europeans and Indians and Africans, but between different African communities.
Sharing resources fairly means basing our decisions on widely accepted principles of fairness in sharing revenue. Most people share the idea that creating a more equal society may require us to treat people differently depending on their different circumstances.
Now, the first thing that you have to think of, and this is the main thing that really drives how we determine how to distribute resources, is the need. Every county is unique. Even when you come to the county level, every ward is unique. Now, our devolution was trying to achieve two things at the same go. Number one, we wanted to bring decision making on how we spend money very close to the people. So that's very important. So the first thing that we have to think about when we are thinking of this principle of need is that we have to make sure that we are able to fund ongoing services. If there is a clinic, we want to make sure that clinic is still able to run. But the second objective with devolution was that we were dealing with a lot of marginalization in the country. And so we were looking at devolution as a way out in terms of redistributing our resources and making sure that devolution plays a catch-up role in terms of bringing counties that are marginalized to enjoy the same level of services as the rest of the country. So there are lots of development deficits that exist in the country. And so the second thing you have to think about need is who is left behind, and how do we make sure that we allocate resources in a way that that ward that is behind is able to enjoy the same level of services as the other wards in the county. Now, the second principle that we have to think about is fiscal capacity. Fiscal capacity just simply means how much money are you able to raise on your own as a county. Because if you're able to raise more, maybe you're able to fund more of your services than the next county that cannot raise as much. So if we are trying to be fair, then that's one of the things that we have to think about. Now, the challenge, there's a negative incentive to this, as you can quickly tell. Because if I'm going to give you more money because you collect less, you have every reason not to collect a lot. So how do we deal with that negative incentive? It takes me to the third principle, which we call it physical effort. Physical effort simply means, for those who are very prudent in how they use their resources, probably you might think about rewarding them in some way in your distribution factors. Now, the good thing about physical effort is that it takes away how much you collect to how much you grow what you collect. Now, the fourth principle is efficiency. And this is something that has to do more with how much do you produce with the money that you put into certain services, with the money that you put into certain programs. Those who are very efficient in the use of their resources, even in our own household, sometimes end up being the ones that you give most of your money to. Now, this principle is a very risky one. If all of you have heard of the session paper number 10 of 1965, it was pegged on a big way on a principle of efficiency. We believed if we put money in areas that are very productive, we are able to produce way more as a country, then we'll redistribute it to the areas that are low potential. How we applied it definitely did not do that. But that is something that is applied in some countries in the world and they've made it work. How we applied ours definitely did not work. Now, the fifth principle is a very basic one. And the fifth principle says, regardless of the unique nature in each of the wards that you have, or regardless of the unique nature in each of the counties, that every region requires some minimum share of what we are distributing so that at least they're able to continue providing some level of service. So simply because there's one that is not, looks very rich, or there's a ward that looks like they don't really fit the bill for a lot of resources to go to them, but still they require some minimum allocation that will make sure that they're able to still continue running. The last one, and I think this is the most important one, especially from where I sit, this is a very important one. And this one simply says that regardless of the approach that you take, it has to be done through a fair process. So the sixth principle is basically fair process. Even if you come up with the best formula in the world, and you come up with one that produces the best, makes sure everyone has everything, if the process by which you arrived at that mechanism of distribution is not seen to be fair, then you're in trouble. We are now working on our CIDPs, 2017 to 2022. Is that process inclusive? Is that process open? Is that process following and thinking through all the other principles that we have been discussing, plus others? These six are basically just what we've seen in terms of global good practice. But there could be some unique thing within Elgeyo Marakwet that you say there's a very important thing here that we'd also like to make sure we are considering as we do this work. So the fair process principle is also very important, and that comes in very quickly as we'll be preparing our CIDPs.
Ultimately, the goal is to achieve equity, and the journey towards this achievement requires a good mechanism of establishing what is equitable. In understanding equity, then, we must first appreciate that equity and equality are different concepts that do not lead to the same outcomes.
For equity, you're pretty much looking at each individual unit and thinking of what is the unique need that each of them has. And so when you're thinking about policy, when you're thinking about access to government services and goods, then you're already taking that into account. But equality, many ways, is really defined as to everyone you give the same. So, and there are many people who push for that. We've seen MCAs push for that. So they say each ward should get the same. So equality looks nice. It looks easy to do. It's actually very easy to do, because all you need to do is make sure just you're giving, as a similar thing or a similar service to everyone. But in many ways, the challenge with equality is that you end up sometimes creating more inequality than when you actually thought you were sorting it out. So the difference for me is simply the fact that in one, you have to really think through how unique and how different are the people that I'm dealing with. And in the other one, all you need to think of is what do I have and how do I distribute it equally to everyone? And I think those two concepts definitely are very different.
So if you read the Constitution, next time you read the Constitution, underline the word equity and equitable. And you will find equity appears 4 times, equitable appears 14 times. So clearly, equitable was seen to be important because equality means that you get the same treatment. But equal treatment may not always be a fair treatment. Because if you have a very rich person and a very poor person, and to say you both get, let's say, 200 shillings a month from the government for old age, well, that's not really fair. One person is a multi-millionaire, other person is starving. So equity had this notion that you have to look at the overall picture, and you see that some counties are doing quite well, that some counties need more assistance because of their historical backwardness, deprivation, and so on. And so equity has this kind of broader notion, and that is why it appears 14 times. I bet you won't find a constitution in the entire world which has equity even once, but leave aside 14 times. So we were very committed to that.
When we speak about equity, we know when it comes to budget work, the county assembly plays a critical role of approving budgets. So how did Elgeyo Marakwet come to convince members of county assembly to pass an equity law that would, because in our county in Baringo, the executive is having challenge to convince the county assembly that there is need for equity law that would see some counties, some wards receive lesser allocation as to what they are receiving currently.
And I actually want to say that this is an act which started from the county assembly. It came as a result of an equal distribution of resources from our first financial year. When we did our budgets, 2013-2014 financial year, we realized that we could not balance the county the way it is required because one, we were new and we didn't have all the information about these counties. So my suggestion is that what needs to be done is the county executive, county assembly, together with the citizens of the county should sit down, identify their needs in a roundtable meeting. And I believe what we've done today is actually what we should be taken to the next level. The charts which we painted today, I think that should be the starting point. Let the citizens, the members of county assembly, the governor and all the executive sit down, waweke, they prioritize areas which need development in the county, and then from there, because I believe even without the act, so long as the three teams, the citizens, the executive and county assembly sit together, they will be able to come out with a very nice way of ensuring that there is equity in the county.
Inequality is manifested in varied forms, sometimes based on geography, demographics, or even gender. In all these forms, the extent of inequality with regard to one person or a region to the others varies too.
As you know, in Kenya, it is very cheap and very easy to make claims that we are marginalized. If you go into a room and you ask people who's marginalized, everybody is marginalized. I have never sat in a room where anyone has claimed not to be marginalized. And those claims, it is not that those claims are not in any way legitimate, but we need to root these claims in data so that we can actually discuss how marginalized different groups are and how we accommodate them through some kind of policy changes, which will involve trade-offs and some people getting some things now and other people getting things tomorrow and so forth. So I want to then suggest that we need to bring together in any policy area, what we are trying to do is bring together data about needs, the needs that different people have, and the finances that we need to address those needs. Of course, we should also have some idea, some policy theory of change, that if we put in money in a particular way to address a particular set of needs, it will yield a particular outcome. And therefore, things will get better and we will move on from there. So we take needs, finances, and some theory of how policy works, and then we get change. That should at least be how things work.
Equity is an appreciation of the differences within our society. When I talk about differences, I talk about differences, demographic differences. I talk about differences, geographical differences. For example, what is the state of access to water in Ward A versus Ward B? That is what equity is about, appreciating differences. Once we appreciate differences, we have to relate this to the fact that we have scarce resources and we have to prioritize. How do we divide resources to meet these differences?
We also looked at distribution, and what we saw is when we look at the county residents per health worker for those 10 categories that we had sampled, we see that there are counties where, like for example, Mandera, there are about 5,000 residents per health worker, and for counties like Nairobi and Isiolo, the number is significantly lower. You'll see for Isiolo it's like 577 county residents, okay, per health worker, which is a huge difference, but this was pre-devolution. Then now we look at post-devolution. We got from 7 counties, and what we see is an increase in health workers, a positive change in health workers, but it's not similar. So you see counties like Samburu, there's 13% increase in health workers, and counties like Turkana, for those 10 categories, 232 increase in health workers. So it's a significant increase. But the trick is just look at the numbers. Still, they don't have as many health workers as they would need for the county, okay? But there is positive change.
Now, in 2016-2017, in the national budget, the government, for some good reason, decided that they were going to present the development budget, not so much in terms of the monies for development going to the departments within ministries, but they decided that they were actually going to list each individual project under the departments and ministries at the national level. Of course, it's quite a huge number of projects, but we decided to focus on the State Department for Infrastructure and the State Department for Water Services. For roads, and let me start with roads at the top. So one measure is simply to look at the unpaved roads, because if you have an unpaved road, we need to pave it. That seems like a direct investment we have to make. So we look at, of all the unpaved roads in the country, what share does each of the county actually account for? So that will give us a measure of the need that exists in terms of roads that needs to be paved. Now, the top 10 counties in terms of the shares of unpaved roads. So when we look at the top 10 counties, they accounted for about 40% of all the unpaved roads in this country. However, when it comes now to their allocation, they only allocated 12% of that capital budget. Now, for the top 10 counties in terms of paved roads, the average is actually 1 kilometer of paved road for every 8 kilometers square of land. So when you compare that to the average, that is pretty good. But they were allocated 55% of the budget. So guys with very good access are getting over half of the budget for 10 counties. Now, the bottom 10, the average is 6,814. Again, when you compare that to the average, you can see that that is actually quite bad. But how much do we allocate them? Just 10% of the budget.
When we grow up, when we're being brought up by our mums and dads, and when we go to church or we go to mosque or we go to temple, we learn some basic values. And one of the things that we are taught is that everybody is special and everybody matters. But when we look today at our societies, we see that we are not living those values. Why is it that in Lavington or Kileleshwa, people have clean water to water their flowers with? And yet in Kibera and Kawangware, people do not have clean water for their children to drink. Why do the top 1% of people have more than half of the wealth? Why is it that in a country like Kenya, just a few thousand families own most of the wealth? It doesn't have to be that way. It can change.
In all these forms, the extent of inequality with regard to one person or a region to the other varies too.
There's a sub-county in Kiambu that has worse child and maternal outcomes than the average in Turkana. Now the question is why? So you'll be sitting around here and you're thinking the central Kenya is all glory and that. No, there are serious problems and inequalities within the counties. And I think what we want to do is how do we get to the sub-county level and then get the conversation around equalization, the same conversation we're having at the national level around equitable sharing of resources should go to the counties, okay? So that MCAs are now asking the same questions that senators ought to be asking.
So we have been working in a couple of subnational places around the country. In Laneto Moja, for example, we did a mini census. We went and sat with the tweeting chief, Kariuki, talked about it and said, let's try and get the citizens themselves to collect data on themselves from every single household. So we got them to actually develop a survey together. We developed a survey together with the citizens. And we got them, give them mobile phones and said, go ye forth and collect data. So all of this data come into play, and all of this data is sitting in the community with the chief. Based on the fact that they have that data, they're able to now, as citizens, come up with their own priorities and decide that this is actually, if government was to solve one problem, then this is actually the one that affects everybody within the community. If that's the case, then solve that one problem. So they did that. They found out that health is a big deal for them. They met the county government just before the elections, which was a really, really good time, and said, if you want my vote, build a health center here. So government said, okay, but we have a problem. We don't know where to put the health center because we don't have land in your area to put the health center. The citizens said, wait, but we do have land because there's a cattle dip. Do you guys know what a cattle dip is? There's a cattle dip in the area that we have not been using for a long time because nowadays we do zero grazing. So convert that into the health center and we're happy with you. So they did. And so Moja has a health center.
Moreover, there is a need for the relevant institutions of government, both national and county, the civil society and the citizens alike, to collect and make available data on current levels of inequality. If there will be any meaningful strides in the fight against inequality, then the relevant data must be available.